I will be sharing screen and everything from the back. That's all you can see from the back end. Everything good there, right? Yes, sir. Sharing screen too. Make sure it's all there. How many videos playing right now? Any good? What are they? Any videos? Just like now.
Check, 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 check 1, 2.
Good morning, Marla. You're muted, by the way.
You would think that after how many years of this, we wouldn't make these mistakes like that again. Good morning, Sherwin. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are things in Barbados?
Great. It's peaceful. This is
We're running through our last set of tests here.
okay.
And in order to make sure that you guys can hear for the most part, we are going to be streaming on YouTube, and I'm going to be sharing that to the
I'm hearing an echo of you. I'm hearing you
that's
twice.
on my end. I will be muting myself shortly. Don't worry.
Okay. Great. It's peaceful. Okay, so you're seeing me and hearing me. Okay, so I can.
We're running through our last set of tests here.
Okay.
And in order to make sure that you guys can hear for the most part, we are going to be streaming on YouTube, and I'm going to be sharing that to the
I'm hearing an echo of you. I'm hearing you
that's
twice.
on my end. I will be muting myself shortly.
Okay, but since you can see and hear me, I will log off and let you guys continue with what you're doing. Okay. I will go on mute. Sorry. Is that all right? Okay.
Yes, the mute is fine, Marla. We're just organizing all that sort of stuff here. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test. 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 Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning, how are you?
We're just testing some of our setup here, so you're actually being broadcast to the room right now. So just forgive me.
Okay, sure.
All right.
Check, check, check.
So I will. Good morning, Dr. Knight. This is just a final test.
Yes, okay. Is that Sharon?
Yes. Can you just give me a test to make sure that we're hearing you well?
Okay. I'm hearing a kind of feedback. I'm not sure exactly where it's
But
coming
no, that's because of where I am. The feedback is from me, not you.
from. So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. I think everybody, at least we're ready on this end. This is just a final test.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to mute myself again, and I'm going to take control from in the room itself.
Sure. Okay.
Alright, I'm going to simply show from the side here on this laptop. Alright, I'm going to show you it's working right now. Just you're not hearing those okay, what is it? I have no jack whatsoever, so if you don't have the jack, you don't have it. Then go ahead and I don't have any. I have none. You can go and ask actually evidently you're only hearing the foreign speakers who will speak this. IT has one of
Jump into the RC. You don't know what you did.
IT doesn't have one?
Yeah, for this. Yes. Give me that one to watch like this.
I don't think really those two have already said already on the this microphone is not like a field detector. I think all of them, that might be the only one that might have some. These are the two feedback.
Good morning, everyone who has joined us here today in the auditorium, and to those of you who are joining us virtually from across the globe, as far as India and China. Welcome to the launch of Professor in Practice Winston Dukaran's book, The Caribbean on the Edge. My name is Clorinda Jack, and I am the Dean of the Ken Gordon School of Journalism and Communication Studies. I will be your host today. Before we continue, I would like to invite Mr. Salim Hussain, our HSE officer, to give us a safety briefing. Mr. Hussain.
Good morning all, and welcome to the Costa Chaguanas campus. Before we start today's activities, just a few house announcements. Firstly, the building has an electronic fire alarm, which will sound in the event of an emergency. If this occurs, please stay calm and in an orderly fashion we'll exit this room. The emergency exit is the same way as you came in unless indicated by a Costa staff member. And the muster point is the furthest point in the car park on the eastern southerly end. Please note that at this time the two exit doors for this room is both on the left and the right, and the washrooms are located on both sides, clearly marked with signage. There are no planned emergencies today, so if the alarm is sounded, please treat it like a real emergency. In the event of an earthquake, please remain calm. Please stay in your seat until the shaking stops. If it's a major earthquake, please stay calm as well, and you could also cover your head with your hands. Once after the shaking would stop, we would evacuate the building and do some damage control after that, right? Lastly, just for COVID-19, we are asking persons to keep their face masks to cover both the nose and mouth while in the auditorium, as well as if you visit the washrooms or outside of the building. And we are asking to social distance as much as possible. We know that the country has lower cases now, but as best as practice, we could social distance as we can. And also to practice proper respiratory etiquette. So if you need to sneeze or cough, please do it so in the crook of your elbow, as well as practice proper hygiene, hand hygiene. And also we're asking members not to loiter after the event because we're trying to reduce the contact time within the building itself, right? And that's it from me. So please enjoy today's activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. We are all committed to remaining safe. As early as July 2021, Professor Dookeran reached out to me to get an updated contact for his longtime colleague and friend, Mr. Ken Gordon, the patron of our school and our chief guest today. He also discussed with me the launch of his next book, The Caribbean on the Edge. After a few emails and telephone calls, our school was on board to host the launch in conjunction with the UWI Alma Jordan Library. Professor Dookeran has said that this is his last book, a book which, I quote, seeks to act as an analytical roadmap to a challenging era of globalization for the countries on the edge of history in the Caribbean. This is certainly a timely book, given the challenges that we face with the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, which continue to adversely affect global economies. I have always considered Professor Dookeran to be a true statesman, and after working with him these past months, I have found him to be very down to earth and always willing to work with us to resolve problems and to achieve goals. Professor Dookeran, this may be your last book, but I feel confident and I know that you will continue to have the interests of our country at heart always. Our country's economic interests, I know you have a vested interest in. At this juncture, I would like to invite Mr. Frank Sudin, Jr., campus librarian of the Alma Jordan Library, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, to bring welcome remarks from the UWI. Mr. Sudin.
Thank you, and good morning to my distinguished co-presenters. Special welcome to Mr. Gordon and our esteemed author, Professor of Practice, Winston Dukaran. I am most pleased to be here with you this morning to lend my voice to the chorus of congratulations being extended to my colleague in the University of the West Indies, Professor of Practice, Winston Dukaran, for yet another landmark achievement in the publication of his latest book, The Caribbean on the Edge. It is my honor also to bring greetings and congratulations on behalf of the principal, senior management, and staff of the UWI St. Augustine campus, and in particular the Alma Jordan Library, with which Professor Dookeran has been collaborating in a more fulsome manner over the past year. In fact, just a year ago, in April 2021, Professor Dookeran approached me with the idea of his donating to the UWI Library a collection of documentation in his possession related to the establishment of the Congress of the People, the political party in 2006, of which he was the first political leader. He felt that this was a critical time in the political history of the country, and that the documentation he had in both print and multimedia formats should be made available for future students in their research and publication endeavors. The project is about to commence, and we have been meeting library staff with Professor Dookeran, and we are about to start doing an inventory of the collection and then looking to catalog and index and archive this special collection in his name. We at the library are committed to preserving this collection for access by researchers many years into the future. We are very grateful and appreciative of his generosity in this regard. It is yet another demonstration of Professor Dookeran's consistent vision and drive to encourage that the linkages between public policy and administration and academic discourse and research are kept tightly interwoven with each other. Winston Dukaran must surely be counted among the stalwarts of the region when it comes to not only his practice in the field, but also his robust analysis of public policy and political economy matters. He has a wealth of experience gained working in public service from his early days as a teacher of economics at St. Benedict's College, right up to the senior positions he held in Trinidad and Tobago, including Minister of Planning, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Governor of the Central Bank. Drawing upon this incredible background and knowledge and his capacity for academic analysis, he has been able to provide us with this latest and very significant publication, which, from all indications, represent a most timely intervention in the face of the challenges gripping our region in these times. I noted from the description of the book that, quote, "The Caribbean on the Edge acts as an analytical roadmap to a challenging era of globalization for the countries on the edge of history in the Caribbean," end quote. As a Caribbean people, ladies and gentlemen, we are sometimes unsure of our current footing, often bewildered about how to proceed. We often need to be guided through the pathways of an uncertain future. Some would even suggest, coming out of the past 2 years of the pandemic and the economic decline that started even before, that we are on the edge of an abyss with our toes hanging over. Perhaps, in truth, we are really on the edge of a watershed moment that, if managed right, can propel us into an era of positive developmental transformation. I, like others will surely do this morning, commend Professor Dookeran for his timely and what will clearly be a significant contribution to the body of literature of the political economy of the Caribbean region
Right?
at a time when we really need it.
But we can't hear
This roadmap to enhancing the Caribbean development experience.
No, we can't.
My hope is that the reading of this book by our politicians, our thought leaders, and the citizens at large will lead to some degree of a change of mindset, a new way of treating with policy formulation and public administration and transformation. I read a quote of Professor Dookeran when he spoke about retirement. And I just want to read it back to you all. Retirement is not a word about life. It is a word about bureaucracy. The need for institutions to organize their finances and let go of older staff. But life does not retire or go into oblivion just because you reach a certain age. Instead, you can choose to do different things from what you used to do before. And you should do these things in ways that preserve your well-being. Thank you, Professor Dookeran, for continuing to inspire us and giving us hope for a better future. Congratulations on this recent publication of the book, The Caribbean on Edge, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sudin. We are all very happy that Professor Dookeran has found new pathways and certainly new chapters in his period of retirement. Kiran Mathur Mohammed, economist, entrepreneur, co-founder of MEDAL, was a key researcher of one of Professor Dookeran's earlier books, Power, Politics, and Performance. This morning, he will provide us with an introduction to the Caribbean on the Edge. Mr. Mohammed.
We are all very happy.
Thank you very much. Professor Dookeran has called this his last book and has spoken about the edge of history, but we're all pretty fortunate that unlike Francis Fukuyama in the 90s, he hasn't yet talked about the end of history. Since those days, which now I'm sure all look upon as the Holkian days of naivety and look upon rather fondly, so much has changed. But one thing is very, very clear. We are now at a point where the black swan is ubiquitous. It's almost become a cliche. Professor Dookeran has always understood this as only a man who has faced down the barrel of a gun of a terrorist and a traitor in defense of his country can understand. And it is in that context where resilience in the face of crisis has always been ever present in Professor Dookeran's thinking and Professor Dookeran's thought, especially in the context of a small state that we in the Caribbean and our and by Caribbean I mean the broader Caribbean basis, face the challenges that confront us. Let me put this to everybody who is listening here. When was the last time that the world came closest to total and absolute destruction? The answer was right here in the Caribbean basin, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? However, despite that, despite knowing that crisis has been so close to us, despite facing crises both economic, demographic, and from a security perspective, we have remained like a frog boiling in a pot. And Professor Dookeran has always been the most urgent voice arguing that we need to wake up. And this book, which, by the way, I'm sorry to say, sir, I do not believe will be your final book, because your ideas continue to be more and more relevant across generations. This book is a wake-up call. Make no mistake. Unless we wake up, we are going to be completely irrelevant in the modern world. Right now, consider this. The Caribbean and the broader Caribbean basin is to the United States, from a geostrategic perspective, what Ukraine is to the Russian Federation. And when you consider that, then you actually start thinking of the possibilities, and the possibilities are alarming. The great powers, namely the United States and China, have been at work. Admittedly, China has been by far and away ahead with Belt and Road from an economic standpoint in the region. The United States has been fairly asleep at the wheel, despite the fact that this is their background, that this is their backyard. But they're slowly starting to wake up with the announcement of their Build Back Better World initiative. At any rate, they're both competing for who can have the worst name possible. But still, what is very interesting about this is our role as small states. And I think Professor Dookeran, who has firsthand experienced the trials of regionalism, is in a perfect perspective to recognize the role of small states and how we navigate an increasingly realist world. And when I say increasingly realist, it is not the case where all of a sudden everybody woke up and realized that nation states must seek their own interest. But it is a case where institutions and the values of institutions, particularly multilateral institutions, and their relevance is being questioned by every local government. And that's in Europe. That this is an increasing trend. Davos man has long been in retreat. So the question is, how does a small state navigate this environment? And this is what Professor Dookeran has long said. We need to approach the multilateral cooperation from a realist perspective. And that may seem like a bit of an oxymoron. How do you approach this type of cooperation and institutional cooperation from a realist perspective? The answer is this. As small states, it is simply the only way that we can seek our own interests. And there are several reasons. One of them is due to the structure of these institutions, which, senatorial as they often are, allow one vote to one country. And it is by banding together as blocks, small states can therefore punch above our weight and have a greater say in matters that, from an economic standpoint, as well as a security standpoint. It also gives us more leverage from a coldly rational perspective. If we can band together, then we can quite simply negotiate better with the great powers. For example, as Caribbean states, we should be looking right now at China's objectives and the United States objectives in the basin, but from a perspective of our own interests. How can we, for example, drive far greater investment in the region by engaging with both sides and basically saying, come on, it's time to play ball, right? So the question there is this. What is now the role of multilateral institutions in this? And what is the role of regionalism in this? And the answer is this. We must communicate to our internal populations, and Professor Dookeran has always known how to do this. He's one of the rare practitioners who has had to communicate ideas from the sphere of international relations, which quite frankly are often seen as irrelevant, wrongly so, by voters in the region. He has had to communicate why that is important to voters in the region. And here's how we do it. We communicate to them that this is going to lead to your short-term economic self-interest. And Professor Dookeran, when he describes the stresses of democracy, I think that is where he has a unique understanding of the fact that we need to appeal from not quite a populist perspective, but we need to better communicate that. The fact that greater international engagement is going to be in the interest of the ordinary man. And this is also when we come to the point of equality, which Professor Dookeran mentions very, very, very early on. Amidst sort of the calls for reparations, one thing is very clear. Here's the way that we can bring our region and restore some of the social injustices. And that way is by engaging with the great powers and simply stating, you are seeking resilience right now. Most people don't know this, but the largest supplier of aluminium to the United States during World War II was Jamaica. Who is the largest supplier of aluminium right now? It is China. The reality is that the old paradigms of efficiency that have long been the hallmark of globalization are retreating. Efficiency is out, resilience is in, particularly if we are to safeguard the security interests of democratic nations. And it is by engaging with the great powers and stating to them, if you want to preserve your resources and preserve your industrial base in democratic countries, which we know will uphold democratic values, then it's time you stood up and supported that. Overall, one thing is very clear. We have no time to waste. And Professor Dookeran has made a case for urgency. Professor Dookeran has long been accused by many in this country as being too academic, which is the old, sort of Naipaul would have laughed very much at that. It's that sort of classic parochial viewpoint. But one thing is very clear. He has always been a man of action. And more than anything else, what I hope that the leaders of this country, as well as both our policymakers and people who are communicating the policy to the population, take away from this book is that sense of urgency and that call to action that we must engage with the world if we are to seek the interests of our nations. Thank you very much, and congratulations, Professor Dookeran.
Mr. Mohammed, thank you for a very thought-provoking and informative presentation. Our next speaker, Jennifer D Domenico, is currently the Manager of Academic Publications at the University of Toronto Press, the publishers of Mr. Dookeran's book. Ms. D Domenico will reflect on the book and its significance on the University of the Toronto Press list. Ms. Domenico? She will be coming to us via Zoom.
Just send a message to everybody to follow us on YouTube. Superstar. Okay.
Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm delighted to just make some brief comments about Professor Dookeran's book. Professor Dookeran was in residence as a fellow at University of Toronto and approached me with the idea for this project. I was absolutely delighted to explore the idea with him. and to eventually take it through the steps to publication in cooperation with the UN's Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. As an academic press, we've been around for over 120 years, and our mandate is to disseminate knowledge and to have the expertise of Professor Dookeran on the politics and economy of this region, and to be able to contribute to spreading this knowledge to a wide audience across the globe really fits in with what we're trying to do as a press. And we're so proud to have this as part of our list in political science and economics. And I just extend my warmest congratulations to Professor Dookeran, and I'm thrilled to be celebrating this launch with you. Thanks so much.
We apologize for the technical difficulty. We hope to have it resolved by our next speaker. Thank you very much, Ms. D Domenico, for bringing those greetings, and we are so happy that the University of Toronto Press agreed to publish Professor Dookeran's book. We will now have 4 commentaries on the book. The first commentary will be given by Andy Knight, who is a distinguished professor of political science at the University of Alberta, Canada, and he now holds a Fulbright chair at Yale University. He was also the director of the Institute of International Relations at the UE and is currently the editor of some prestigious journals in the field of international relations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andy Knight.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I think we're having some difficulties, technical difficulties here, but it seems as though I'm on now. So let me just say a few words here about the book, and congratulations to Winston Dukaran for another excellent publication. You know, Caribbean on an Edge, on the Edge, is really a comprehensive analysis of the developmental challenges that is facing the Caribbean countries and the Caribbean region. And I think the primary goal of the book is to devise a sustainable future for the Caribbean. And, you know, we are dealing with a set of challenges that the Caribbean faces, including the complex challenges of COVID-19 pandemic, decline in economic growth across the region, the collapse in the tourism sector, the drop in energy prices, and the increase in energy costs to individuals and businesses in the region, the impacts of climate change, of course, the vulnerabilities that we face from climate change impacts, the devastating effects of natural disasters, extreme weather events, etc. And I think the premise of this book is that we need to have a change in the way we manage these set of circumstances. And the pandemic itself has exacerbated the deep structural inequalities and the imbalances that undermine the Caribbean development strategy and the trajectory of the Caribbean development program. And this is all occurring at a time which they call the Interregnum. The Interregnum really is this period of time that we see a shift from the old world order of 1945 to something that's coming that we haven't yet seen the full outlines of. But it offers us an opportunity to reflect on the ways in which the Caribbean as a region can, to use that overused term now, build back better, but basically to recover in a sustainable way from some of the challenges that we have faced. Are we learning anything from the lessons of the past? I think this book is really challenging us to think about this. What about the vulnerabilities we face as a result of external shocks? What are we doing in terms of changing our approach to concessional financing, which has been a problem for many of the Caribbean states, especially those that have become now sort of growing in economic terms? Are we overly dependent on official development assistance? Does the middle income category of many Caribbean countries simply put us on the back foot? Now, are we willing to make the kinds of structural changes that are necessary for long-term sustainable growth in the region? What are we doing to pull the Caribbean back from the edge? This is a really challenging book because it really gives us an indication of some of the areas that we need to be moving towards in order if we're going to reach the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. If we want to reduce poverty and unemployment, if we want to enhance women's empowerment, if we want to achieve food security, if we want to improve health and sanitation, and so on, all these things we need to really accelerate the actions of the region and to find new pathways to realize the goals of the 2030 Agenda and achieve sustainable growth in the region. So one of the things I like about this book is that it gives us a very clear picture, panoramic view, if you will, of the what they call the most globalized region in the world, the Caribbean. I think Winston has called it a crucible of globalization. But we are living within a very turbulent period, the Interregnum, as they call it, a time of turbulence, of flux in the global economy, a time when there is potential political challenges to the political landscape, and the fact that we have to sort of change our mode of doing things has been a real central element of the book. Small states like those in the Caribbean are really on the edge. Often they are in a state of crisis, a continual state of crisis, and this is really a result of the systemic and external shocks, the environmental risks that we face, the vulnerabilities that we face. And the leadership has been questionable in the region. The institutions are now becoming suspect in many respects. I think Amina Mohammed asked that question about whether or not the institutions are fit for purpose. We have to ask ourselves that question as well. A number of questions that are raised in the opening to the book, which I should raise with you here. I'm sure many of you will be reading the text and you will see the answers to some of these questions. But how might we shift the paradigm to expand the reach of the Caribbean's economies from the typical limitations of integration, Caribbean integration that we've talked about for the last 40, 50 years has seemed to reach its limits. What is the scope of convergence theory that Winston Dukaran has been offering as a solution to the limits of integration? How can small countries like Caribbean countries capture the space in the global markets to make themselves not just sustainable in terms of their ability for development, but also to make themselves competitive and to accelerate the growth in the region? And how can we best unlock the paralysis that seems to set in to our region? I've been decrying for some time now, ever since I was at the Institute of International Relations as director of the Institute, the fact that CARICOM seems to be at a standstill. And we had a wonderful forum on the future of the Caribbean, which Professor Dookeran led and I was a part of, in which we tried to think about ways of freeing ourselves from the constraints of traditional thinking, the limitations that we've imposed upon ourselves by entrenched views on how we should develop. And a lot of people in the region keep saying things like, you know, this is not done, this is not how we do things. You know, just maintaining this sort of old traditional way of acting. This book this book really challenges, just as the forum did, the region to think differently, the region to think differently about leadership, the region to think differently about management, and Winston Dukaran has used the convergence idea as a central conceptual feature of the book. Now, convergence is probably not understood as well as it should in the region, but it requires a kind of a realignment of political and economic thinking. It recognizes that Caribbean integration has reached its limits. It recognizes that there is now an urgent need to respond to the current realities of the day. So I wouldn't go any further because I know that others are coming in to speak more about the book, but I just want to say that I really enjoyed the text. I'm going to definitely use it in my classes. I'm here now at Yale University, and we're going to be looking at some of these issues, particularly looking at convergence theory that Professor Dookeran has espoused in this book. So thank you very much. I hope you were able to hear me because I'm not hearing many of the speakers, and I'm not sure exactly where I'm plugged into the program, but thank you very much for giving me some time and attention.
Our apologies once again. Despite several test runs, we still have some technology challenges. We're trying to stream simultaneously via Zoom and YouTube, so we're getting some feedback from one of the channels at this point in time in the room, hence the distorted audio that you experienced. So we do apologize for that. Thank you very much, Professor Knight. We will be sure to go back onto YouTube. For those of us who did not get the full essence of your presentation, it will be available on YouTube. Just use the link that we had shared with you. Our apologies again. I would now like to introduce, to speak to us, Ambassador Rodolfo Sobongi. He is the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States. Prior to his appointment as Secretary General of the ACS, he held senior executive positions in Panama, where he excelled in public policy issues in the world of business. He was also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Rodolfo Sobongi.
Have to lower it. Thank you very much for this great invitation, Dr. Dookeran. Right away, I was very impressed with your prefix. Your name is Kiran Mathur Mohammed. Maybe we can bring you as an economic advisor to the ACS. It is an honor for me to be part of this distinguished group of presenters. As I read The Caribbean on the Edge, I have to admit that I could feel the anguish, the sensibility, and the love that Professor Dookeran clearly holds for the Caribbean, but also because it is an anthology, the evidence of a lifetime dedicated to the study and analysis of the social and economic issues that affect the Caribbean. This book tells a story of his relentless search for solutions to the Caribbean problems. As he states, the Caribbean is a complex region characterized by great disparities in size, population, geography, history, language, religion, race, and politics. And I think that the list could go on and on. In my view, this two-line description of the Caribbean lets us see through a small window his appreciation for the myriad facets of the object of his lifelong subject of study, the Caribbean. A beautiful, fragile, but promising region with a tormented soul, distressed from an unjust past, and full of inequalities, which make it difficult to think of a prosperous future. And it is in light of these afflictions that this anthology allows us to see the humanist behind the author, the man seeking to improve the quality of life of people by providing equal opportunities to all and eliminating injustice so that the region can flourish as an important player in the international context. As I read the book, I couldn't help remembering a quote by Ted Kennedy. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their peers, the censure of their colleagues, and the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet, it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. I can see through reading his book that Professor Dookeran is one of those brave men with moral courage who seeks to change a region that yields most painfully to change. I have to say that since my very first encounter with Professor Dookeran as Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, I identified that we shared belief that the ACS has the potential to be the catalyst for convergence. It is a space that brings all the countries of the greater Caribbean together despite their differences in size, population, GDP, so that no one really should remain behind. It is for that reason that I was not in the least surprised that the book has many references to the ACS. I am going to read only a few of them and then briefly explain what we're doing at the ACS on the areas that he mentioned in the book. Page 32, under the title, "The Caribbean as a Buffer Zone in Diplomacy," he states that the Caribbean must work within the realities of the new global economy, and the policy environment must arise to provide a development buffer zone, similar to what has been said before. As we strive to emerge on a higher international platform. In this context, the establishment of the Association of Caribbean States can be seen not as an integration process per se, but as an attempt to strengthen the region's negotiating position in international diplomacy. This poses an opportunity for the Caribbean to move away from its traditional posture of protest diplomacy toward a more affirmative stance in which vital interests are identified and promoted in anticipation of changing balances in world politics. I'm not sure when this was written, but it is valid today as much as before or more. On another paragraph in page 39 under the title, "On Changing Roles in a Changing World," Professor Dookeran says, CARICOM, although it may have reached its limits and in economic terms come to a dead end, may be widened beyond Suriname to include the Dominican Republic and Haiti. The ACS, like a medicine in search of a disease, is looking for its own platform. The stage is perhaps set for the emergence of a different notion of regional state as a vehicle for creating political and negotiating space in the international arena. Perhaps Keohane's distinction between operational and formal sovereignty may now be incorporated in the new theoretical construct for institutional behavior in the Caribbean region. There are so many references to the ACS throughout the book that I could quote them and take the whole day here. But I would like to take this opportunity to reflect on what we are doing in the association to address and fulfill some of Professor Dookeran's expectations. When I was designated Secretary General, the first thing I did was a strategic diagnosis in which I recognized many of the dilemmas mentioned in Professor Dookeran's book. In the first meeting I held with our executive board, I proposed to do a strategic planning exercise to assess the new world order, the new realities, and redefine the association's vision and mission to satisfy the best interests of its members in light of everything that's going on. In the first meeting of our ministerial council, I presented a white paper called Strategic Assessment of the ACS, which really served as the base to discuss the development of our new action plan. Maybe my background as planner allowed me to recognize early on what Professor Dookeran says in his book. The ACS is a medicine looking for an illness. But what puzzled me is that one doesn't need to look much farther for the illnesses. The dramatic socioeconomic situation plaguing the region and exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and climate change, and now with that, the impact of the war between Ukraine and Russia are clear symptoms of that illness. In the past 6 months, we have been working on our new action plan. Early on, it was recognized that 3 years of an action plan was too short a period for planning. So for the first time in the history of the ACS, the action plan will be tabled for approval by the Ministerial Council next week as a 6-year one. Maybe the action plan doesn't directly address trade integration or convergence, but it does approach these critical enabling exercises from several fronts. With a strong emphasis on actions to improve the competitiveness of the region, the plan establishes digital transformation and the improvements on communications and information technology as the cross-cutting themes, recognizing that these are the basis for that knowledge economy, or those knowledge-based economy mentioned by Professor Dookeran in the book. The action plan includes the development of an integrated transport and logistics strategy, which is critical for improving connectivity in the region, also mentioned in the book. And it includes actions to better manage and adapt to the impact of climate change and thereby reduce disaster risks and accelerate recovery of the tourism industry in a sustainable manner. We're also including in an action to support the Caribbean Development Bank's initiative to develop and establish a resiliency index, which could be used as a better measure of states' vulnerability, also mentioned in the book. And finally, one of the most important aspects of our proposed action plan, the action that best addresses the argument for a regional state in the operational sense, is the development of a regional public-private partnership, not only for infrastructure, but for services. This in recognition that transport and logistical services, when driven only by market forces, will provide services only if they are profitable. In the case of this region, profitability is not a driver that will guarantee development because of the low density of demand. We cannot depend on the public sector either, because most governments after COVID are not in the position to acquire debt because of their fiscal situation, much less to operate and manage transport and logistics services with a negative cash flow. Here is where I see the potential of the beginning of a regional state, with the creation of a multi-country public-private partnership for maritime and air services enabled by a regional technological platform which could also be developed through a PPP. In a newly multipolar world that demands stronger regional institutions to maintain balance, there is a role for the Caribbean despite its history of fracture. This is the hope held up by Professor Dookeran in his book, The Hope of Convergence, practical and ideological to bridge the disparities in size, population, geography, history, language, religion, race, and politics, and transform them from complexities into assets, from disease into antibodies. He alludes in his book to the role of the ACS in this healing process. 28 years after its founding, I believe the ACS is poised to play that role. I look forward to Professor Dookeran's new book, analyzing the effects of the medicine. Perhaps, Professor, I might propose a title I would submit, The Renaissance of the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Sibongi, thank you so much for sharing with us in such detail the initiatives of the Association of Caribbean States. I'm sure we are all in agreement with you when you said that Professor Dookeran is indeed a brave man with moral courage, who has a deep love for the Caribbean. He has displayed this throughout his life and throughout his service to our country. Our next speaker is certainly no stranger to any of us. Mola Dookeran is an accomplished Caribbean economist and advisor who is dedicated to eliminating corruption, reducing gender and income inequalities, and building fiscal resilience. She is a regular contributor to international publications and is a highly recognized speaker on critical issues affecting the regional economy. We would now like to invite Ms. Dookeran, who is coming to us via Zoom also, fingers crossed, that we will be able to hear her presentation. Thank you. Ms. Dookeran?
Good morning, everyone. Are you seeing and hearing me? Okay, all right. I got a thank you for that, Professor Knight. So, first of all protocols observed, and my warmest and most heartfelt congratulations to Professor Winston Dukaran. I really want to be just like you when I grow up, launching one book while completing the next. And please drop me a note and let me know what vitamins you're on. And thank you so much for having me this morning. I got a thank you for that from a previous book Professor Dedication read. So This book is dedicated to the 148,345 sons who voted in support of the heartfelt congratulations, general elections, I really want to be just like you. And the reason I mentioned this book is because I firmly believe that had the COP been successful in securing a majority there, and had you and your comrades then had the opportunity to lead our country through the crises we have faced since, perhaps our country would not be one of those most on the edge. Anyhow, I digress. I found this book to be exceedingly pleasant to read and reflect on. And so I thank you, Professor Dookeran, for giving me this gift. One of the truths I have distilled from this book is that our policy solutions in this region and beyond are largely experimental. And how can they not be when the world around us is so dynamic, so fluid, and our environment is literally increasingly hostile with what 400 natural disasters between 1990 and 2019, and now this pandemic. The second truth is that we are at a policy standstill. We suffer from policy paralysis, as discussed quite extensively in this book. But this book gives us the hack on how to fix this and some of the other long-standing challenges we face as a region. And institutional reform is at the heart of this hack, which is the third truth, that institutional reform is critical, not just for our development, but for our very survival. Again, drawing on the fact that climate change, we're getting feedback. But this book gives us the hack on how to fix this. I'm on mute. Long-standing challenges I'm not sure what to do because I'm only on one device right now. But I'll continue. That institutional reform is critical. So where was I? Right. And drawing on the fact that climate change poses an existential threat, we need climate adaptation now, lest we become climate refugees. Reforming the way we live and work and do business and trade and educate the next generation. All of this is crucial, as outlined by Professor Dookeran in this book. In particular, that the sequence of reforms, and I quote, the sequence of reforms can affect not only the performance of the economy in the short run, but also the momentum for the continuation of reforms. I found that to be quite powerful. The next generation of reforms are in progress, according to Professor Dookeran. So the next phase is being contemplated, focusing on 3 E's: exports, education, and enabling government. And I could not agree more. Without enabling government and ease of doing business, we are stuck. Exports and investments are the GDP variables with the most positive effects. And education, maybe we can slow brain drain if we get the other 2 E's right. Another truth, and possibly the one I am most in love with from this book, is, and I quote, political skills have been in short supply. And increasingly, not even the rhetoric can hide the failure and the disappearing vision. How heartbreakingly true. What to do? Well, the consensus model of democracy, as discussed in the book, versus the majoritarian model has been suggested. But this would require major constitutional reforms. And the challenges of regional security, another painful truth, that non-state actors abound and wield considerable power, often more than states. That one really hit me hard as well. And that the only way to face this threat is by regional and international cooperation. And we need to do this because our hard-won socioeconomic gains could be completely wiped out because of crime. Another heartbreaking truth is that, and I quote, this is the politics of illusion, where yesterday's hopes remain unfulfilled and new hopes emerge with little expectation that they will be realized. And that the only way to face also, you highlight that in the Caribbean, there has been a net outflow of resources to multilateral institutions. I would have loved to hear more about that because I did not know this to be the case. perhaps we can discuss over lunch one day when you come to Barbados. I could go on and on about these truths that struck me really hard in this book, but I don't want to monopolize the mic. I will end with another favorite, and I quote, "The agenda before scholars and policymakers is extensive, but we can neither succumb to the forces of history nor surrender to the new vulnerabilities that will surface in the path ahead." And they say that the best way to find out what lies on this path ahead is to ask someone who is on their way back. Professor Dookeran, I congratulate you and I thank you for this important work. And I pray that you will be around for a very, very long time to come to help guide the next generation of policymakers in the Caribbean. Thank you very much and walk good. To the new vulnerabilities that will surface in the path ahead. And they say that the best way to find out what lies on this path ahead is to ask someone who is on their way back. Professor Dookeran, I congratulate you and I thank you for this important work. And I pray that you will be around for a very, very long time to come to help guide the next generation of policymakers in the Caribbean. Thank you very much and walk good.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dookeran. You, like Professor Dookeran, you are both truth speakers. When you speak, people listen and they question. We too would like to know what vitamins you're taking, Professor Dookeran, so you can share it with me after. Oh, your lovely wife. At this juncture, we would like to have and invite Emeritus Professor of Economics at UWI, Professor Compton Bourne, who has had a most distinguished career, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Principal of the St. Augustine campus of the UWI, and Pro-Vice Chancellor of UWI. He is a highly acclaimed academic and author of several books and scholarly articles. Professor Compton Bourne.
I was really happy and honored by the invitation of the author, Professor Dookeran, to speak at the launch of this book. I had no hesitation in accepting in tribute to him, who's been my colleague and friend since the 1970s, a very long time. The book, The Caribbean on the Edge, by Professor Winston Dukaran, distills from and recapitulates many fundamental analyses and observations about Caribbean political economy and international engagements of Caribbean countries during his long and distinguished career as parliamentarian, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and Professor of Practice at the University of the West Indies Institute for International Relations, and visiting scholar at several high-ranking universities in Europe and the US. The book draws upon his quite extensive and panoramic knowledge of features, trends, and issues in the Caribbean and the world. I think that Chapter 1, entitled Caribbean Development, Setting the Framework, is the major launching pad for what follows in the rest of the book. There is a plethora of insightful observations and comments, Professor Dookeran correctly states that the policy and strategic approaches of the 1960s and 1970s are no longer sustainable. He notes the increasing divergence between political and economic boundaries and the disappearance of privileged spaces for the Caribbean in the global economy. Of course, there he's referring to the loss of trade preferences and even the loss of geopolitical significance, which underlies underlay many of those preferences. He argues that incentives matter for performance improvements in both the public sector and the private sector. And I want to emphasize this, in both the public sector and the private sector. With respect to the political economy of international engagement, he asserts that the political legitimacy of the nation state is not threatened by changes in operational sovereignty per se, that new realities in the world necessitate the surrendering of some operational sovereignty in order to retain legitimacy and viability, and that open regionalism is a way of achieving a development model which simultaneously pursues economic growth and social equity, both of which are major challenges for us in the region, and indeed for many countries in the world. Correspondingly, the international engagement of Caribbean countries must change from protest diplomacy to an affirmative foreign policy based on their vital interests. I think many of us who have labored in the vineyard of Caribbean politics and economics or political economy know that very often our foreign policy is, if I'm not going to be very charitable, very often is a policy of gestures and sometimes just simply profiling. That it very often, very infrequently corresponds to pursuing our vital interests. And I think this is a key point made in the book. On the economic front, Professor Dookeran argues for a resource shift growth strategy in place of the value-added strategy which still predominates in the Caribbean. This too is a very key observation and key point, that we have to change the way in which we develop or construct our development programs, focusing less on how we will add value to existing things that goods and services that we produce, and how, in fact, we will organize the resources and develop new products on the basis of our resource capabilities. He characterizes, and someone else, I think Marla Dookeran just said it, he characterizes Caribbean politics as the politics of illusion, where yesterday's hopes remain unfulfilled and new hopes emerge with little expectation that they will be realized. It is therefore unsurprising that Professor Dookeran recommends revision of the prevailing forms of political governance to make possible greater national consensus and wider community participation in decision making. This, he states very clearly, is especially necessary in plural societies which are prone to political stress. The contents of chapters 2 to 7 in the book are just as insightful and thought-provoking. One can gain many insights, many lessons from what is covered in those chapters. But I want to spend my remaining time on some of the ideas and suggestions by Professor Dookeran in section 3 of the book, which deals with pathways in analytical leadership. In chapter 8, he makes a powerful case for what he terms Caribbean Sea Convergence and provides a diagrammatic representation of that process.
Three major conceptual elements of Caribbean Sea convergence are identified. The first is convergence of economic spaces through integration mechanisms to increase leverage in production and competitiveness. The second is convergence of institutions which enable new political and economic dynamics in the process of Caribbean integration. The third is partnership between the public sector and the private sector. Several critical sets of strategies for Caribbean Sea convergence are identified. One set is financial strategies, which include regional stock markets, development finance, capital mobility, and most important, creation of domestic financial buffers against adverse external economic shocks. We know that in this region, with some changes in recent times, our countries have had to rely very often on the multilateral financial institutions and on bilateral donors in confronting unexpected developments in the international economy and even developments arising from the occurrence of natural hazard events. Another critical set of strategies is what he terms resource clustering. Clustering of resources through regional groupings of firms, which would enlarge the pool of knowledge, the availability of talents, and the financial resources available to firms for innovative competitiveness and endogenous transformative growth. The third set of strategies is transnational infrastructure investment, notably in sea and air transportation. When I reread this a few days ago, I smiled wryly to realize that only now, after so many years, there seems to be some movement in the region by the decision by heads of government recently to go out, to put out a tender, something in relation to regional sea transportation. This has been coming up over and over. We just have not, as a region, appreciated the importance of sea transportation. We overemphasize the importance of air transportation. Professor Dookeran also examined policy issues and approaches to developing a culture of knowledge through higher education. He discusses forces for change, which include technological change and pressure by stakeholders for improvements in quality and innovations in education services and products. Other forces for change are the rising costs of delivering higher education, commercial objectives, and social equity considerations. He references statements by various higher education experts, like a former president of Harvard University, who warn about the dangers of excessive commercialization and the danger of yielding to political and market forces. Chapter 12 is a very important chapter. It's a chapter entitled Getting Governance and Development Right. And this chapter should get the attention of everyone in the Caribbean. It discusses choices for the future. Professor Dookeran draws attention to the industrial development strategy of small Mediterranean European states like Sweden and the Netherlands, which is closely and successfully calibrated with agendas for social and political reform. That is a economic development strategy which, of necessity in their case and successfully in their cases, was calibrated, was linked to an agenda for social reform, an agenda for political reform. And he concludes, having looked at that experience, that the yardstick, and I quote him here, the yardstick for measuring their success is the extent to which social coalitions, political institutions, and public policies facilitate shifts in factors of production that increase economic efficiency with due regard to the requirements of political legitimacy, end of quote. Professor Dookeran terms this a model of democratic corporatism or social partnership. In his assessment, the governance model and politics of the Caribbean are serious obstacles to successful reforms. He states that the distribution of power in favor of elites reinforces the status quo, and that the courts system very often operates as an arbiter and as a substitute for the will of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude by simply saying that The Caribbean on the Edge is a sober, realistic, forward-thinking book. But at the same time, it is a work of hope for this generation and future generations of Caribbean peoples. Professor Dookeran, you have done us a great service in putting together this work. And like others, I look forward to seeing the future, the things that come out in the future from you. It is, again, an honor and privilege to be here today.
Professor Bourne, thank you for your candor and for sharing such noteworthy insights into the book. We have heard from many commentators and we have heard from others today, but now we would like to hear from the author himself. Winston Dukaran is currently professor in practice at the UWI. Prior to this, he held visiting positions at the University of Toronto, Harvard University, and the United Nations University in Helsinki. He is a graduate of the London School of Economics, London University, and the University of Manitoba, where he received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree for distinguished public service. He has authored and edited several books on the Caribbean. He was also the governor of the Central Bank and later the Minister of Finance in Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Professor Winston Dukaran.
I am so bewildered by my colleagues who have spoken here today. And I start with a special word of appreciation and honor to my dear friend and colleague, Mr. Ken Gordon, for gracing us with his presence in the institution that is ascribed with his name, in posterity for his contribution to our country and to the Caribbean. I start by saying a special word of deep appreciation to Carinda Jack and Sherwin Millett from the School of Journalism and Communication Studies, who at very short notice at the end put this together, and in such a way that throughout the world, hopefully, many of our colleagues would have heard of it. I received a very interesting comment from a colleague in Fudan University in Shanghai, who will be 12 hours away when this is happening, indicating his desire to listen to it, which was an indication of the global reach of the new technologies we are in, and my own search to build a larger cadre of people interested in Caribbean development. But I want to formally acknowledge Alicia Bacena, just retired as the Executive Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Professor Nelson Wiseman of the University of Manitoba, for it is their individual support that allowed me the opportunity to be at their institutions in Washington, D.C. and in Toronto, Canada for a few years, and allowed me the time and space to be able to put my thoughts together with the help of many others there and elsewhere. And I say a special word of them, thanks to them for allowing me the visiting appointments to the Economic Commission for Latin America and to the University of Toronto. Our presenters here today have done more than human service to myself, and I hope it will inspire the readers of tomorrow and the students thereafter to be able to go through the book and read it. We have not a tradition of reading, but I hope the situation in which we are and have been and will be will warrant many to begin the process of reading as a first step in the search for discovery. So I thank all our contributors. You heard them here today. I must make a special appreciation to Jennifer D Domenico, whom you heard earlier on, to the extent we were able to hear. To Janice Evans, who was the actual editor of the book, and to Terry Teskey, all of the University of Toronto Press, and to Inez Bostello at the UN ECLAC office in Washington, now at the IMF, for their encouragement, their expertise, and above all, their patience. Had it not been for their individual sense of commitment, I felt, putting a book together in today's world is quite a task. And I thank them most sincerely for staying the course and having the patience. Much has been said, and I hope others will be able to look in depth. But I want to, in these words that Clarinda afforded me here today as chairperson, to just make a couple of quotes from the book to establish a few points, what I call points of the edge. One is on the subject of human justice. The other on the subject of fixing the economy. And the third is on the object, Your Excellency, on Caribbean diplomacy. On the quest for human justice, and this is a direct quote from the book on page 50-51, at the core of political economy are the prospects of economic growth the concentration of power, and the forces that generate inequality. Thomas Piketty, and I quote him, "We have not modified the deep structure of capital and inequality that today threaten to generate extreme inequalities that stir discontent and undermine democratic values." Piketty's undermining democratic values and Amartya Sen's notion that development is freedom mesh under the rubric of justice. The fight for democracy has historically been viewed as a battle for justice. And it is freedom that permits societies to pursue the cause of justice. What human justice can do is to solve or attempt to solve concrete problems of the individual and societal life, to enact and enforce norms, to create institutions, to design processes, all with one goal in mind: to solve actual problems. The anguish and outrage that erupted in my homeland in the aftermath of the brutal murder of Andre Bharat, and soon after another heinous murder of Ashanti Riley, two of our young women, have left our society naked, shaken to the core, and exposed whatever it takes solutions to regain human freedom and dignity. Leaders have been left speechless, and those whose duty it is to uphold the constitutional order of the country are clearly stunned and confused. Adhering to the norms of the justice process cannot explain the outcome of that process. And it will be a colossal abdication of public responsibility to simply move on until the next episode occurs. You know what has occurred since. The next quote is on fixing the economy. And on page 77, this is what I said: building an immune economy. As the economy enters loop-type cycle of demand and shock, all policy prescriptions for recessionary times are no longer work. Thank you, Professor Borden. The coronavirus crisis, as explained, has induced a supply shock, reducing wages and production, which in turn fuels a demand shock and a fall in purchasing power, resulted in a loop cycle of shocks. This is coupled with the aftershock in the energy sector, with future ripples to come from dramatically falling growth rates in the world economy. The size, the speed, and the depth of these hits have contracted the Trinidad and Tobago economy by an estimated 20 to 25%. The task now is to get the economy back on its feet, to snap back into activity, and to walk a new road where there will be absorbers and buffers for immunity in the economy. The next quote is on page 91, called Towards a Universal Basic Income. In spite of some current actuarial concerns, the National Insurance Board is the most reliable institution promoting social security. we have an opportunity to implement a livable basic income for those now out of any catchment area if existing support programs focusing on the new vulnerables. This can be considered social investment rather than additional public expenditure. And in a philosophical sense, this sort of measure is consistent with the rights-based approach to development, shaping a new normal that gets to the core of sustainability. The cost of the program can be negotiated into the transaction from the proceeds of the CLICO proposal referred to earlier in the book. And finally, on the economy, entitled The Catalytic Role in Development, on page 85 and 89. Turning around the economy often requires a shift from the step-by-step process of conventional models towards new approaches based on capturing strategic options. Models of state-centric governance, as opposed to state control, have often worked in tandem with the free market system. The obstacles to the growth process lie in undue reliance on the state and its outmoded controls and system. Major economic costs are incurred, but market forces by themselves will not suffice to protect the public good. We must embrace a catalytic role for the state, a role that causes change. To capture these and other opportunities, rapid economic growth must be the main driving force and objective of a catalytic entity like catalytic investments. If it catches on, we can learn by doing, testing new waters, rather than swimming in an already traveled lane. And finally, in terms of my quote on Caribbean diplomacy, under the title, Pandemic as a Global Political Stress Test, on page 203 and 92. Capable states with good leadership who enable reforms become stronger and more resilient, while those with weak state capacity, political and economic, will be in trouble and set for stagnation. All paradigms are looking tired. Global institutions are in flux, and the change in geopolitics is open up a strategic shift in areas of diplomacy, particularly for small states. Diplomatic agenda for the Caribbean could end up in no man's land, according to Sir Ronald Sanders, who summed up the dilemma this way. One certainty in any new global dispensation is that countries who fail to act together will remain in the backwater of the human development. This is particularly true for CARICOM countries, he concluded. Perhaps the time offers the Caribbean a geopolitical opportunity to define its regional state. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving it meaning. Refrain from a sterile focus on the implementing deficit in CARICOM and captured a new architecture, an architectural design fitting for the geopolitics of the Caribbean history and geography. And I end these quotations with the first line on page 201 in the epilogue of the book. And it says, "A book rarely stands on its own. It comes from somewhere and sometimes travels unknown paths." That is what I believe your presence here hope for. That is what I believe those who have listened to this book launch would wish. And that is what, in my heart, I hope will be the outcome of putting this effort together in the name of Caribbean people, Caribbean society, Caribbean history, and Caribbean development. Thank you.
Professor Dookeran. Professor Dookeran, thank you for those very heartfelt words. You are a true patriot, a true Caribbean man. And I think that you have left us all with lots of food for thought. We thank you. I would now like to invite Professor Dookeran again to come and present books to, firstly, our chief guest, Mr. Kenneth Gordon, then Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations at the UWI, and I will be receiving on behalf of Dr. Paul, who is unavoidably absent today. Thank you. Oh. And also to Mr. Frank Sudin, the librarian at the Alma Jordan Library.
Is she here? Is Byron here?
Is Professor Byron here?
I didn't see her.
Okay.
Sure, somebody from the ministry will be here.
Okay.
I'm from the institute.
Is anyone else here from the Institute of International Relations at the UWI?
Okay.
We now invite Mr. Sudin.
Thank you for your words.
You are very welcome. Thanks for the invitation today.
And thank you. We should probably give Mr. after that. Yeah.
Dr. Millett, Professor Dookeran would like to present you with a book.
This is a personal copy in honor of all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dookeran, for your generous donations. I would now like to invite Mr. Roddy Batchersing, our senior lecturer in journalism and media for the past 13 years, to give the vote of thanks. Mr. Batchersing.
Thank you, Ms. Jack, for your very kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I have been conferred with the privilege of doing the vote of thanks today, for which I am very grateful. I have to start by expressing our collective gratitude to the incomparable Mr. Winston Dukaran for creating this critical book and for always bringing tremendous value to Caribbean discourse. Thank you, sir, for always being a consummate citizen of the Caribbean. I want to say a special thanks to the audience today for making this occasion such a special occasion, and for your patience and understanding for our small challenges. We do appreciate your presence here today and for making it such a wonderful moment. Thank you to Mr. Frank Sudin for your very kind welcome remarks and also for your outstanding representation of the Alma Jordan Library of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Thank you to Mr. Kiran Mathur Mohammed for your excellent and exciting prelude to today's proceedings. It really gave us an excellent start to today. Thank you to Miss Jennifer D Domenico for her time today and for bringing greetings from the University of Toronto. Thank you to the brilliant speakers who gave such discerning commentaries on Professor Dukaran's book today. Professor Andy Knight, Ambassador Rodolfo Sobongi, Miss Marla Dookeran, and Professor Emeritus Compton Bourne. Thanks to each and every one of you for your formidable analysis and for your elucidation of the ideas of this work. Your commentaries today will certainly stay with us for a long time. Thank you, Mr. Ken Gordon, for occupying the very critical role of chief guest today. Your presence here today certainly enhanced this occasion immensely. We have to thank the inexhaustible Dean of the Ken Gordon School of Journalism and Communication Studies for the superb job she did in chairing what was certainly a power-packed program. We'd like to thank Dr. Sherwin Millett and his marketing team for all the unseen, detail-oriented work. Their support and commitment were quite indispensable, and as you all know from the pandemic, it is always quite a lot of gymnastics to do a hybrid global event in a small space. But I think things still turned out quite well. Thank you to the media for being here today and for sharing today's launch with the rest of the public. And we would like to conclude by expressing our considerable gratitude to our two hosts, which are the Ken Gordon School of Journalism and Communication Studies at COSTAT, as well as the Alma Jordan Library at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. This collaboration, I believe, was truly a success, and we look forward to working together again in the future. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and we conclude here. We'd like to wish you all safe journeys home, and also to thank you for continuing to observe the COVID protocols as you have done very fastidiously. We thank you for that, and we ask you to please continue. We hope that you enjoy your afternoon and that you continue to enjoy this excellent book. Thank you.
I know you're going to be busy.
I love your presentation.
Thank you. I will send it to you by email. I had to cut it down, so I'll send you the original. But I would like to have yours if possible.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
I think it is also worth publishing it.
Come in tomorrow, I think.
Okay.
Dong, and I can sign them.
Perfect.
But thanks, Sophie, and you made a very, very good presentation.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And,
I think